Daniel chapter 11. You know, this is probably, you could easily say, the most difficult chapter, 11 and 12, in the book of Daniel. And I've been looking at it all day and before today and preparing for this class, and I think I need a Tylenol. It's a wonderful study, but there's so much in there, and there's so much about world history that it's world history that I never knew or learned in school. A lot of details, and that's what's amazing about it. It is a very, very detailed, down in the weeds prophecy about what is going to happen from Daniel's perspective in the future. And we'll see a lot of things that are similar to what we've seen throughout the book, and we'll see some new things as well. And I'm excited about the study. Just hang with me, and we're not going to cover every detail that he covers in the chapter. I think we could probably spend a whole quarter on Daniel 11, because there's a lot there. But we will cover some of the highlights as we go through. So let's begin by reading in verse 1. In the first year of Darius the Mede, I arose to be an encouragement and a protection for him. And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia, then a 4th will gain far more riches than all of them. As soon as he becomes strong through his riches, he will arouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece. And a mighty king will arise, and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. But as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom will be broken up, parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass, though not to his own descendants, nor according to his authority which he wielded, for his sovereignty will be uprooted and given to others besides them. Let's pause there for a moment. Let's identify the speaker in verse 1. Who is the speaker? In the first year of Darius the Mede, I arose to be an encouragement for him, a protection for him. Well, you've got to back up into chapter 10, which we covered last week, and we left off a little bit short in chapter 10 last week. But remember what's happening in that chapter is an angel has come to Daniel, and Daniel is very upset. Daniel has been fasting and mourning for 3 whole weeks. And the angel comes to give him insight about this vision that has troubled Daniel so much. And we learned just a lot of really fascinating things there about spiritual warfare and angelic beings, and the fact that Michael comes to help this angel, and they're fighting against the prince of Persia, who is not a human being. And they're fighting against, or will be fighting against, the prince of Greece. And so you get this vision of spiritual warfare. So this angel is telling Daniel all of this, and then he says in verse 1 of chapter 11, it's still the angel, I believe, talking here. In the first year of Darius the Mede, I arose to be an encouragement and a protection for him. And then he launches in to explaining the vision that Daniel had. Let's take a bird's eye view of the chapter first, and then we'll start breaking it down. So an overview of the prophecy. Note that chapters 10 through 12 are all about the same prophecy. Chapter 10 are about the events that happened before the angel explains it to him. Chapter 11 and the first part of 12, we're talking about the same prophecy all the way through. And so it's a long one. And we need to ask ourselves, in my schooling and so forth, Greg, you probably could attest to this too, or the engineers among us. You try to bound the problem, right? So that's sometimes helpful. So let's bound the problem and talk about when do the events of this prophecy begin and when do they end. So take a look at 11:2. When does the prophecy begin, with reference to Daniel? When does it begin? What's it say? All right. And he's talking about the kings of what nation? Persia. So we're talking about Daniel's time. We're talking about, if you look back at chapter 10 and verse 1, we're talking about Cyrus. So there are going to be more Persian kings. And Daniel, remember, is an old man here. He's approaching the end of his life. But the prophecy clock starts here with these 3 more kings of Persia that are coming. And when does the prophecy end? Now, this is going to be debatable, but it tells us when it ends. It's just a matter of us understanding what it means. When do the events end? Take a look over at chapter 12. Remember, chapter 12 is still part of the same prophecy. Look at 12:7. I heard the man dressed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, as he raised his right hand and his left toward heaven, and swore by him who lives forever, that it would be for a time, times, and a half a time. Now listen, and as soon as they finish shattering the power of the holy people, all these events will be what? Completed. When will the events of the prophecy be completed? According to 7. When he shatters, when let me get the wording right here. The shattering of the power of the holy people. All of these events will be completed. Well, what is that talking about? And this is where we probably could have some debate. But what is the shattering of the power of the holy people? First of all, who are the holy people? The Jews, right? I think that makes sense. The Jewish people, Daniel's people, the people of God. So what is this shattering of the holy people? Anything come to mind? I heard the end. Teresa, what did you say? Okay. Good thought. Heard something else over here? Babylon? Okay. Okay, so you've got people saying, well, this must be more of a modern time thing. Some are saying this must be the time of Babylon, and they did shatter the Jewish people in 586 BC. Well, there was another big event, the shattering of the Jewish people, big event that we've talked about. You remember? The destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, right? Where the Romans came in and totally destroyed Jerusalem, totally destroyed the temple. And I tend to go with that one. That's what we're talking about in AD 70. The Jewish nation, the whole system was completely shattered, and it never recovered. As far as the temple being rebuilt, the sacrifices, all of that stuff ended in AD 70. So maybe we've bound the problem a little bit. Let's talk about sort of an outline of this chapter. In 11:2, we've seen there are going to be remaining Persian kings that are coming, not long from when Daniel is living. And then in verses 2 through 4, we're going to see the rise of the Greeks and the rise of Alexander and the death of Alexander. And let's just take those two events first off. Sounds familiar, right? We've seen this kind of thing before in Daniel. So look at verse 2. Now, usually I don't put verses up on the screen a lot, but I just didn't know how to approach this material that would help you to see it. So I'm going to put some of the verses up on the screen. I'm going to highlight some of the terms, and then we'll talk about what they mean. And the neat thing about this, until we get to verse 36 of chapter 11, you can track all of this that's being prophesied. You can look back from our perspective, and you can see it happening in history. You just follow it right along. But you have to really know your world history. And it's things I didn't know and I had to read about. And it's very, very detailed, as you'll see. So look at verse 2 again. And now I'll tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia. You look into history, can we see who those 3 kings were? Cyrus is the current one. And then we have Cambyses, Darius the First, and Xerxes. Anybody sound familiar to you here? Xerxes, perhaps? So Cyrus is the current one, and then you have 3 more. So when we talk about then a 4th will gain far more riches than all of them, we're talking about the 4th, Xerxes. He will gain far more riches. As soon as he becomes strong enough, he will stir up the entire empire against the realm of Greece. Greece is still a couple hundred years in the future. I mean, just step back and think about the amazingness of all of that. He's calling them out by name before the empire comes to be. And I think this is, just so we don't lose sight of the bigger picture here, that's one of the things we need to marvel at. That God knew all of this. He knew exactly what was going to happen. He calls it out through this vision to Daniel. God is in control. He is in control of world events. He always has been. He is today. We can take great comfort in that. Look at verses 3 and 4. And a mighty king will arise, and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. But as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass, though not to his own descendants, nor according to his authority which he wielded, because his sovereignty will be removed and given to others besides them. Who is this mighty king who arises? That's Alexander. Yeah, we've talked about him, right? And what does it mean when it says his kingdom is broken up and parceled out to the 4 points of the compass? Who are we talking about? Or what are we talking about? You remember? This goes back to chapter 8, which was a while ago. What happened when Alexander the Great died? Yes. Remember the shaggy goat? The 4 horns come up in place of the 1 horn. You may be tired of seeing that guy. But I like him, so I put him up again. The big horn, Alexander the Great, goes away. The 4 horns come up in its place. Lysimachus, Cassander, Ptolemy, and Seleucus were the 4. Now there's a lot of history there. You could spend a lifetime studying all of that. But we're going to focus for most of chapter 11 on 2 of these 4, namely Ptolemy and Seleucus. Now, does anyone know? You get extra points if you know. Who did the Ptolemies rule over generally? Look at that. I got several with extra points tonight. And what about Seleucus, the Seleucids? Yeah, very good. Syria, generally areas north of Jerusalem. And what we're going to see as we go through chapter 11, he's going to talk a lot about the king of the north. We're talking about a Seleucid king and the kings of the south. We're talking about kings that come from Ptolemy. And here's a map, just so you can kind of see that. Here is Jerusalem for reference. Notice the Ptolemies are down here to the south, like we said. Seleucus took this area north, generally, of Jerusalem. And then the other 2 are up here. But we're going to focus on the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. Let's just pause there for a minute. Questions, comments? Clear as mud? Good so far? I got to have some feedback. This making sense so far? Okay, let's keep going. Verses 5 through 20. I just struggled on how are we going to do 5 through 20? Because I just put this in my own words. There is a lot of drama in 5 through 20 between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, the north and the south. They're fighting and fighting. There's war after war. They're fighting over various things. And again, you could dig into all that stuff. If you want to dig into that more than we will tonight, I can point you to some resources for that. But there is a lot going on in these verses. Let's take a look at some of it, though. Look with me at verse 5. The king of the south will grow strong along with one of his princes, who will gain ascendancy over him and rule. His domain will be a great realm indeed. And after some years they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to reach an agreement. But she will not keep her position of power, nor will he remain with his power, but she will be given up, along with those who brought her in, and the one who fathered her as well as he who supported her in those times. Whoa, that's a mouthful. That's a lot going on there. So you can track this in history. I mean, it's fascinating because hundreds of years before, he's calling out in this specific detail what's going to happen. And so I didn't know any of this. I had to read through the history of it and consult some of the commentaries and things. The king of the south here is the king of Egypt, Ptolemy I, Soter. And again, I can point you to resources to check it out for yourself. One of his princes, that was a general of his, Seleucus I, they make an alliance. Essentially, this is a marriage. It's a political marriage. And this daughter of the king of the south is Bernice. Anybody heard of her, perhaps? Bernice. I had an aunt Bernice, but other than that. Yeah, there's another one in Acts. Yeah. Good point. Don't get your Bernices mixed up. There's a Bernice in the New Testament. So they make this alliance between north and south. Bernice marries Antiochus II. This is not Antiochus Epiphanes. He comes later. But in order to make this marriage, he divorces his first wife, Laodice. She's really mad about that. She poisons the king. She poisons Bernice and the child. And so, lots of drama, as we said. But again, it's amazing that God is calling all of this out. And then you look back in history, and that makes sense. It tracks right along with what God said would happen. And you could go through this kind of exercise again and again and again in this section of chapter 11 and point out all of the characters. And it just makes your head spin because some of these people have a different name. They're called something else by some other people, and you're trying to line all this up. And it makes your head spin a little bit. But it is fascinating. Take a look at verses 13 and 14, just to skip ahead a little bit. Now, we've moved ahead in time, so we're at a different king of the north than in the previous verses. For the king of the north will again raise a greater multitude than the former, and after an interval of some years he will press on with a great army and much equipment. Now in those times many will rise up against the king of the south. The violent ones among your people will also raise themselves up to fulfill the vision, but they will fall down. So here we're talking about a different Antiochus. This is Antiochus III. And what I wanted to point out here essentially is that there were violent people among the Jews who supported Antiochus III, but it was to their own detriment, because by supporting Antiochus III, they paved the way for who? Antiochus IV, Epiphanes. And We'll talk about him in a second, but he was a bad, bad guy. It's really bad for the Jewish people. So God called it all out ahead of time. Take a look at, let's go back to the outline. When we get past verse 20, we start talking about Antiochus IV Epiphanes. So let's pick up in verse 21. We're going to see here the campaign that he waged against Jerusalem, which was an absolute horror. We've talked a little bit about that. It was ear-tingling, horrendous kind of stuff. A little background on this verse. Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He had a campaign against Egypt. And the Romans were on the rise at that time, and the Romans basically stop him in his tracks and turn him around and send him back. And he's not happy about that. So that's kind of the background of this verse. For the ships of Kittim, that's Cyprus, that's Roman-controlled territory, Roman soldiers on these ships. The ships of Kittim will come against him, therefore he will withdraw in fear and will return and curse the Holy Covenant and take action. The Holy Covenant, what are we talking about? The covenant that God has with his people. He curses the Holy Covenant. So he will come back and pay attention to those who abandon the Holy Covenant. In other words, Antiochus gives special treatment and favor to those who would abandon God. And we read about in Josephus, the historian, about exactly how that happened and what happened. If you read on, he will come back and pay attention to those who abandon the Holy Covenant. Forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary, fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. This was a horrendous thing. Do you remember some of the things that Antiochus did to the people of God? Anybody heard of this? Circumcised? Yeah. Yes, that's right. Death, the death penalty if you circumcise your children. Now, what did the law of God say? On the 8th day, you circumcise your baby boys. Antiochus said, if you do that, you'll die. And he put to death thousands. I think 80,000, according to Josephus, were either killed or enslaved. And they would crucify people. They would kill their babies and hang them around their necks. I mean, it's horrible. He did away with the regular sacrifice. You're not allowed to sacrifice to God. In fact, remember he took the pig broth, the blood of pigs, and sprinkled it all over the temple. And of course, that was a horrendous thing to the Jews. That's an unclean animal. He sprinkled it all over the sanctuary. He set up an altar to Zeus in the sanctuary and sacrificed pigs on the altar. And he's just slaughtering God's people. And he talks here about the abomination of desolation. Have you seen that term before? Somewhere else, perhaps? The abomination of desolation. Jesus uses that term, right? In Matthew 24. And he's talking there about the Romans and how the Romans are going to destroy the temple of God, not leave one stone left upon another. So that was Antiochus Epiphanes. Questions or thoughts? It's a lot to hold together, right? And we skipped a lot. It's a lot to hold together. Bob? Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Rivalry for power, that's right. And war after war after war over these hundreds of years. They're just, that's it. They're after power and prestige. And you see the troubles that it brings. Other thoughts or comments? Let's take a look at the overall outline again. Let's look at the actions of the faithful Jews of that time. Now, there's amazing stories here about these faithful Jews, because you had a lot of people, of the Jewish people, who turned evil. I don't want to die. I don't want to face these consequences. I don't want my children to die. And you think about that, and that's a heavy thing. Put yourself in their shoes. If I circumcise my child, I'm going to die. A horrible death. My family's going to die. And so many, they went along with it. They just, okay, we won't do that. I just can't do that. I'll just go along with Antiochus's demands. But what about the faithful? Let's take a look. Look at verse 32. By smooth words, talking about Antiochus here, by smooth words he will turn godlessness, those who act wickedly toward the covenant. But the people who know their God will display strength and take action. There were some who said, I will not do this, and I will die before you make me not circumcise my children. I will die before you, make me not offer sacrifices or worship God or have a copy of the Scriptures or whatever. I'll die before I do any of this. 33. Those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many. Yet they will fall by the sword and by flame, by captivity and by plunder for many days. There were teachers among the people who were encouraging them, stay true to the Lord. Don't go along with this. And giving them insight about the Word of God. You know what happened to a lot of those teachers? They gave their life for that. As he says in 33, fell by the sword, by flame, by captivity, by plunder for many days. I would encourage you sometime, if you get the chance, to read the book of 1 Maccabees. It's, I believe, a historically accurate document. It is not an inspired document. The Jews even didn't see it as inspired, but it's Jewish history. And the holiday of Hanukkah, right? It comes from this story that we see in 1 Maccabees, and it's an interesting read. But you see there this family, and they're working against everything that's going on. They're working against the Greeks and everything they're trying to do. And there's told a story of one of the Jews that is being forced to sacrifice a pig on the altar to this idol. And one of these, I don't remember who it was. Somebody help me, but one of these Maccabean of that family, they rise up and they slaughter this Jewish person who's doing this, and they slaughter the Greek person who's forcing them to do this, and they say, we've had enough of this. We're not doing this anymore. And it starts the beginning of this revolt against Antiochus, and eventually they take the temple back, they cleanse the temple and everything, but it's at an enormous cost of lives that this happens. And so look again at verse 33. Those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many, yet they will fall by sword and by flame, by captivity and by plunder for many days. Now when they fall, they will be granted a little help, and many will join with them in hypocrisy, So not many are around to help, and a lot of people are full of hypocrisy. I mean, again, put yourself in this situation and how hard this would be to remain faithful to God in this kind of circumstance. 35. Some of those who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time. So let's just pause there, because when you get to verse 36, things change, and it's difficult to tell how exactly they're changing. In fact, if you would, this week, take a look at 36 through the end of the chapter, or even into chapter 12. See what you make of it. See what you think is happening in those verses. But let's talk for a second about these faithful Jews with the couple minutes we have left. I think we need to ask ourselves, what would I do in this situation? Right? Because we're not facing anything like death in this country. Some Christians do face death for their faith today. What would you do? What would you do if your life was on the line? I know it's easy to sit in this comfortable building and think through that. Oh yeah, I would be faithful to God. But the question is, what are you doing to prepare yourself for that kind of thing? Because it could happen to us. I don't know if it'll happen. You don't know, but it could. How are you going to prepare yourself? Dave.
People on both sides of it would say they would die, but then again, you think you die, you can't do any good for anybody. You want to help people and do the things for people. So you think, well, let's go along with that and live and go on my life and do what I want.
Yeah.
Help people and we pray to God and ask for forgiveness if we sin. If not,
That's a dangerous road, isn't it? Because you can start to rationalize, right? Just like that. Well, if I stayed alive, I could do this, that, and the other thing, and I could repent later, but what if they take your life from you? And this is not what God wants to say. I'm not going to stand firm, but I'll repent later, But it's a temptation, isn't it? But,
I think God wants you to die.
well, he says, be faithful until death, and I'll give you the crown of life.
But it would be hard, it would be easier for me to, I think, to give up my own life and how these people were having their babies.
Yeah,
That would be harder for me.
definitely.
That would probably keep me the
Yes. Yeah, that's much worse, isn't it? And of course, Satan and his forces, they know that. They know that. And that's what's going to get to us is, oh, my kids. What am I going to do about my kids? How do you prepare? I'm not saying we'll face this. I'm just saying that we could. How do you prepare for it?
You need to ask the Lord for help.
Yeah.
Prepare yourself for life.
Ask the Lord for help. Yeah, right. Prepare me.
Well, pray.
A lot of praying. We need to be building our faith. We've said this over and over through Daniel. We need to be building our faith now. If you're not building your faith now while things are fairly easy, what's going to happen when you get into a situation like this? Your faith will crumble. So always be preparing your faith when things are good, when things are relatively easy. And, I think we can pray to God too that we wouldn't have to face this kind of thing. But I don't know if that's within his will or not. I don't know if it's in his will for our children, our grandchildren. But there's a lot of evil in the world. And we saw the evil forces, the spiritual forces of wickedness that are working against God's people. So we need to be ready. And we need, as we've said, we need to have we need to follow the example of Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these Maccabean people that you read about in history, they said, I'm not I'm not going to do this. Even if it costs me my life, I'm not going to abandon my God. So that's the encouragement for tonight. Next week, we will get into 36 and into chapter 12, and it gets more difficult. So read ahead. Look into it. Thank you all. See you Sunday.